The sun was setting over the Georgia interstate when James Cooper guided his 18-wheeler into the crowded rest stop. His shoulders were stiff from 12 straight hours behind the wheel, and the familiar smell of diesel and hot asphalt filled the air. The parking lot was busy with the usual mix of tired families in minivans and fellow truckers taking their mandatory breaks. Just another normal Tuesday, James thought to himself as he reached for his logbook. At 34, he'd been driving trucks for 3 years since leaving the Marines, and these rest stops had become as familiar as his own backyard. He liked the routine of it all, the rhythm of the road, the quiet moments like this when he could catch his breath and stretch his legs. As he jotted down his hours, something caught his eye in the side mirror. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement that might have gone unnoticed by someone else. But Marines are trained to notice details, and something about this detail made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A young girl, probably 14 or 15, was standing near a black SUV about 3 spaces down. She was wearing a bright yellow hoodie that seemed too warm for the Georgia weather, and her eyes kept darting around nervously. What really grabbed James' attention was her hand. She was making a gesture he recognized from his military training, a silent cry for help that most people would mistake for casual fidgeting. James kept his face neutral as he watched through the mirror. 2 men were with her, both in their 40s, dressed in plain clothes that were trying too hard to look casual. One was talking on a phone while the other was filling up a water bottle at the drinking fountain. They looked ordinary enough, but James noticed how they positioned themselves, always keeping the girl between them, their eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. The girl made the gesture again when the men weren't looking, this time more deliberately. Her eyes met James's in the mirror for just a second, and in that moment, he saw a mix of fear and hope that made his stomach turn. He'd seen that look before, during his tours overseas, the look of someone trapped, silently begging for help. James felt his military training kick in, slowing his breathing, clearing his mind. Every instinct told him to jump out of his truck and confront the men, but he knew better. In situations like this, rushing in could make things worse. He needed to be smart about this. Pretending to still work on his logbook, James carefully observed every detail. The SUV's license plate, the men's appearances, the direction they were headed. He noticed how the taller man kept his hand near his jacket pocket, how the girl's shoelaces were missing from her sneakers, how neither man touched the food they'd bought from the vending machine. Years of military experience had taught him to look for these small signs, the tiny details that tell the real story. But it had also taught him something else, that the best way to help someone isn't always the most obvious way. As he watched the group walk back to their vehicle, James reached for his phone. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He knew what he had to do, and he knew he had to do it right. This wasn't going to be just another normal Tuesday after all. Keeping his movements casual, he started forming a plan. The old familiar feeling of pre-mission focus settled out of him, the same feeling he had countless times in the Marines when lives were on a line. Except this time, he wasn't in a combat zone. This was happening right here, at a regular rest stop on I-20, where families were buying snacks and tourists were studying their maps. The girl looked back one more time as they led her to the SUV. James gave her the slightest nod, just enough to let her know he'd understood. He'd seen her signal. Help was coming. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage start with the smallest moments of attention, and James Cooper was about to turn this ordinary rest stop into the beginning of something extraordinary. James kept his eyes fixed on the side mirror, carefully watching the scene unfold while his mind raced through possible scenarios. The girl's yellow hoodie stood out against the darkening sky, making her easy to track in the busy rest stop. His years of military training had taught him to notice the little things, and right now, those little things were painting a disturbing picture. The taller man kept one hand on the girl's shoulder, not in a caring way, but with a firm grip that spoke of control rather than comfort. The other man walked slightly behind them, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot like a guard on patrol. James had seen this kind of behavior before, and it made his blood run cold. Through his mirror, he caught another glimpse of the girl's face. She couldn't have been older than his niece back home in Tennessee. Her dark eyes held a mix of fear and determination that reminded him of civilians he'd helped during his tours overseas, people who hadn't given up hope despite their circumstances. She was trying to appear calm, but James noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted her backpack. The two men didn't look like what most people would expect traffickers to look like. The taller one wore a polo shirt and khakis, like a dad on a weekend outing. The other had on a business casual outfit and glasses that made him look like an accountant. That was part of their disguise, James realized. Hiding in plain sight, blending in with the normal flow of travelers. But there were signs if you knew what to look for. The way they positioned themselves around the girl, creating a human barrier. How they never let her walk more than a step away. The supple hand signals they used to communicate with each other. The fact that the girl's phone never came out, unusual for a teenager on a long trip. James noticed other details too. The girl's shoes were expensive running shoes, but they were scuffed and dirty like she'd been wearing them for weeks. Her hoodie was too big, probably not her own. And though she carried a backpack, it looked nearly empty, like it was just for show. When they passed near his truck, James could hear snippets of their conversation. The men's tone was quiet but firm, with an underlying edge that made his jaw clench. The girl's responses were short and mechanical, like rehearsed lines in a play she didn't want to be in. "Remember what we talked about," the taller man said, his voice barely carrying to where James sat. "Just act normal, and everything will be fine." The girl nodded, but her eyes told a different story. As they walked past, she made the distress signal again. A quick, supple movement that most people would miss. But James didn't miss it. He couldn't miss it. That signal was part of his training, drilled into him alongside first aid and tactical maneuvers. It was designed to be discreet but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Time seemed to slow down as James weighed his options. His instincts screamed at him to intervene directly, to confront the men and end this situation right now. But experience had taught him that rushed actions often led to tragic outcomes. If these men were really traffickers, and everything he was seeing suggested they were, they might be armed. They might have backup nearby. And most importantly, any wrong move could put the girl in even more danger. He watched as they approached their SUV, noting how the men positioned themselves to block any potential escape routes. The girl's shoulders were tense, her movements becoming more rigid with each step. James could almost feel the weight of her fear from where he sat. This wasn't just about witnessing a crime anymore. This was about being perhaps the only person who had noticed what was happening. The only one who had recognized the signs and understood what they meant. The rest stop was full of people, families getting snacks, truckers taking breaks, tourists checking maps, but to everyone else, this just looked like a normal group heading back to their car. James thought about his own family, about his niece who loved soccer and spent too much time on social media. He thought about all the training he'd received, all the situations he'd been in where quick thinking and careful planning had made the difference between success and failure. This girl's life could depend on what he did in the next few minutes. As he watched them load into the SUV, James knew he had to act. But he also knew he had to be smart about it. The girl had trusted him enough to signal for help. Now he had to trust his training and experience to figure out the best way to provide that help without making the situation worse. The black SUV pulled out of the rest stop, merging smoothly onto I-20 westbound. James watched it disappear into the flow of traffic, his mind already racing through possible scenarios. His years in the Marines had taught him that gathering information was just as important as taking action. Right now, information could mean the difference between success and failure. Taking out his phone, James opened his Notes app and quickly typed in everything he'd observed. The SUV's license plate, Georgia tags starting with XRK. The men's descriptions, one about 6'2" with graying temples, wearing a blue polo shirt. The other shorter, around 5'9", with wire-rimmed glasses and a slight limp in his right leg. The girl, young teenager, dark complexion, yellow hoodie, probably 5'4", hair in 2 braids. But it wasn't just about what they looked like. James remembered how the men had moved, the way they scanned their surroundings, how they communicated with subtle gestures. These weren't amateurs. They had training, maybe military or law enforcement background. That made them more dangerous, but it also meant they'd likely follow predictable patterns. "Think it through," James muttered to himself, something he used to say during difficult missions. He pulled out his trucking route map, spreading it across the steering wheel. I-20 westbound from Atlanta had several major stopping points. Based on their fuel level, he'd noticed their gas gauge when walking past. They'd need to stop within the next 200 miles. James knew the trucking routes like the back of his hand. 3 major truck stops were coming up, but only one had the right combination of facilities and escape routes that professionals would look for. It was just outside Birmingham, a sprawling place with multiple exits and easy access to secondary highways. He glanced at his logbook. He had enough driving hours left to follow at a safe distance, but he'd need to be smart about it. Getting too close could spook them. Keeping too far back risked losing them. And all the while, that young girl's life hung in the balance. Opening his center console, James pulled out the small notebook where he kept emergency contacts. During his time in the Marines, he'd worked with various law enforcement agencies. Some of those connections might still be active. He hadn't called in favors for years, but this wasn't about favors anymore. This was about saving a life. First, though, he needed to document everything. James pulled out his backup phone, an old flip phone he kept charged for emergencies. He took photos of his notes and the map, marking the likely stopping points. If something happened to his main phone, he'd have backups of the crucial information. The truck's CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers discussing traffic and weather. James turned it down, focusing on his mental checklist. In the Marines, they'd had a saying, "Proper planning prevents poor performance." Right now, proper planning could prevent something far worse. He thought about the girl's face again, the way she'd managed to stay calm while signaling for help. That took courage. The kind of courage that deserved a proper rescue, not a rushed attempt that could put her in more danger. James had seen too many situations go wrong because someone rushed in without thinking things through. Looking at his watch, James started calculating distances and times. The SUV had left 12 minutes ago, heading west at roughly 70 miles per hour. They'd hit the Alabama state line in about an hour. The Birmingham truck stop would be another hour after that. That gave him time to set things in motion, to make the right calls and put the right pieces in place. He pulled up his phone's map app, checking alternate routes. If the traffickers spotted him, he needed to know every possible way to maintain pursuit without being obvious about it. The old 2-lane highways that parallel I-20, the surface roads, the connecting routes, he studied them all, committing them to memory. James thought about his own niece again, about how vulnerable kids could be even with loving families. This girl, whoever she was, deserved to go home to her family. But getting her there safely would take more than just good intentions. It would take planning, patience, and the kind of strategic thinking that had kept him and his fellow Marines alive in far worse situations. Starting his truck's engine, James took a deep breath. The familiar rumble helped steady his nerves. He'd been trained for high-stakes situations, for moments when lives hung in the balance. Now it was time to put that training to use. Not on a battlefield this time, but on an American highway where evil tried to hide in plain sight. As he pulled out of the rest stop, James ran through his plan one more time. Follow at a safe distance. Document everything. Make the right calls to the right people. And most importantly, stay focused. Because somewhere up ahead, a young girl in a yellow hoodie was counting on him to make the right decisions. And James Cooper had no intention of letting her down. James's hands were steady as he dialed the non-emergency number. The highway stretched out before him, his truck maintaining a careful distance behind the black SUV. The setting sun cast long shadows across the interstate, and his mind was focused on making this call count. "This is Officer Chen." A calm voice answered after 2 rings. James took a deep breath, remembering his training about how to communicate in critical situations. Clear, precise. No room for misunderstanding. "Ma'am, I'm a truck driver on I-20 westbound, about 40 miles east of the Alabama state line," he began, keeping his voice level. "I need to report a suspected trafficking situation. I'm a former Marine, and I recognized a distress signal from a young girl at the rest stop near Atlanta." There was a slight pause on the other end. When Officer Chen spoke again, her voice had sharpened with attention. "Can you describe what you saw?" James shared every detail, just as he documented them: the girl's yellow hoodie, the men's descriptions, the SUV's license plate, the specific hand signal he'd recognized. He explained how the men's behavior matched trafficking patterns he'd learned about during his military training. The girl used the signal twice, he explained. Once when the men weren't looking, and again when they were walking to their vehicle. It wasn't random, she knew exactly what she was doing. Officer Chen typed rapidly in the background. Are you following the vehicle now? Affirmative, James replied, checking his mirrors. Maintaining visual contact from a safe distance. Based on their fuel gauge and driving patterns, I believe they're heading to the major truck stop outside Birmingham. His training had taught him the importance of sharing not just what he saw, but also his reasoning. It helped law enforcement understand they weren't dealing with a panicked civilian, but someone who knew how to assess a situation. Sir, I'm coordinating with State Patrol units now, Officer Chen said. Can you safely maintain visual contact while I patch you through to the trafficking task force? I can do that, James confirmed, adjusting his speed slightly as traffic thinned out. I've got about 5 hours left on my drive time, and I'm familiar with all the alternate routes in case they exit unexpectedly. The line clicked, and a new voice joined the call. This is Detective Wilson with the Human Trafficking Task Force. I understand you're tracking a suspicious vehicle. James repeated his observations, adding details about how the men communicated with each other and their professional-looking surveillance patterns. He could hear more typing in the background, followed by quick radio communications. We're putting units in place, Detective Wilson explained. But we need probable cause for an intercept. Can you tell me more about this distress signal? It's a specific hand movement, James explained. Part of a universal distress code. 3 quick gestures that look casual to most people but mean danger to those who know it. I learned it during trafficking prevention training in the Marines. The detective's voice grew more urgent. That's exactly what we needed to hear. We've got units moving into position, but it'll take time to coordinate across state lines. Can you stay on the line? James glanced at his fuel gauge, nearly full. He had snacks and water in the cab. Most importantly, he had a clear view of the SUV about a quarter mile ahead. I'm not going anywhere, he assured them. The next few minutes were filled with rapid coordination. James provided updates on the SUV's location while the detective organized with different law enforcement agencies. They discussed possible interception points, contingency plans if the vehicle changed course, and how to ensure the girl's safety during any intervention. One more thing, James added, remembering a crucial detail. The men are probably armed. The taller one kept adjusting something under his jacket, and they both move like they've had tactical training. Understood, Detective Wilson replied grimly. That's valuable intel. We'll plan accordingly. As James drove, he thought about all the training exercises he'd done in the Marines. All the scenarios they'd practiced, the protocols they'd memorized. None of it had felt real then, just preparation for possibilities. But now, on this stretch of American highway, every bit of that training was coming into play. The sun had fully set now, and the highway was lit only by headlights and the occasional overhead lamp. Somewhere ahead, in that black SUV, a young girl was hoping someone had understood her cry for help. James adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set with determination. We've got unmarked units moving into position, Detective Wilson updated him. They'll maintain distance until we're ready to move. You've done everything right so far. Now we just need you to help us keep eyes on them. James nodded, even though they couldn't see him. I'll stay with them as long as it takes, he promised. And he meant it, because sometimes being in the right place at the right time wasn't enough. You had to be willing to see it through, no matter how long the night might be. The night had settled in completely now, turning the highway into a river of headlights and taillights. James kept his truck steady, maintaining the perfect distance behind the black SUV, close enough to keep track, far enough to avoid suspicion. His CB radio occasionally crackled with updates from unmarked police vehicles strategically positioned along the interstate. Target vehicle maintaining speed at 70 miles per hour, James reported quietly into his phone. Detective Wilson was still on the line, coordinating with state patrol units from both Georgia and Alabama. They've been checking their mirrors more frequently in the last 10 minutes. Acknowledged, the detective replied. They might be getting nervous. Have they changed their driving pattern at all? James watched as the SUV smoothly changed lanes to pass a slow-moving minivan. No sudden moves. They're driving carefully, too carefully, like they're trying not to attract attention. His experience as both a Marine and a truck driver came in handy now. He knew exactly how to position his rig to look like just another trucker making his nightly run. The weight of his dog tags under his shirt reminded him of all the times he'd had to stay calm in tense situations. The highway signs indicated they were getting closer to Birmingham. James could feel the tension building in his shoulders. This was always the most dangerous part of any operation, the moments right before action. One wrong move could spook the suspects and put the girl in danger. "We've got units in place at all major exits," Detective Wilson updated him. "State Patrol is running rolling roadblocks 5 miles ahead, slowing traffic naturally. Our goal is to force them to take the truck stop exit." James nodded to himself, understanding the strategy. "They'll need fuel soon. I saw their gauge at the rest stop. They can't push much further without stopping." The next few minutes stretched out like hours. James watched as traffic gradually began to slow, backing up ahead of them. It looked natural, just typical nighttime congestion. But he knew better. Each seemingly random truck and car ahead was carefully placed, part of an invisible net slowly closing in. "They're taking the exit," James reported, watching as the SUV's turn signal blinked on, moving toward the truck stop, just as predicted. The truck stop sprawled out ahead, a bright island in the darkness. James knew every inch of it from his regular routes, the layout of the parking lot, the blind spots behind the building, all the possible escape routes. He'd shared this information with law enforcement during their planning. "Multiple units in position," came the response. "We've got plainclothes officers inside the building and unmarked cars in the lot. Stay back but keep eyes on them." James eased his truck into the lot, taking a spot that gave him a clear view of the SUV. The two men got out first, scanning the area just like they had at the rest stop. The girl in the yellow hoodie stepped out last, her movements still tense but controlled. "They're heading inside," James narrated softly. "The taller one has his hand near his jacket pocket again. The other one's keeping close to the girl." His heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. Years of training had taught him how to stay calm when every instinct screamed for action. He watched as the group disappeared into the building, knowing that plainclothes officers were already in position inside. "All units ready," crackled a new voice over his phone. "Transport team standing by for the minor. Medical personnel on scene." James gripped his steering wheel tighter, remembering similar moments from his Marine days, the calm before the storm, the weight of knowing lives hung in the balance. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a truck stop in Alabama, where a young girl's future would be decided in the next few minutes. Through the building's large windows, he could see the group moving toward the restroom area. It was the moment law enforcement had been waiting for, when the suspects would be forced to separate briefly, making them more vulnerable. "They're approaching the restroom corridor," James reported. Girl in yellow still with them, both suspects still scanning constantly. The response was immediate but quiet. "All units move in, soft entry. Priority is protecting the minor." James held his breath, watching as regular customers continued their business, unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Somewhere in that building, trained officers were closing in, ready to end this nightmare. He thought about the girl's face from the rest stop, the silent plea in her eyes when she'd made that distress signal. Soon she would be safe. Soon she would be able to go home. All because she'd been brave enough to ask for help, and because people had been ready to answer that call. The night wasn't over yet, but James knew the hardest part was almost done. He'd kept his promise. He'd stayed with them, helped guide law enforcement to this moment. Now it was time to let the professionals do their job, to turn this ordinary truck stop into the scene of something extraordinary, a rescue that would change a young girl's life forever. Everything happened so fast, yet somehow in slow motion. James watched from his truck as ordinary-looking customers in the truck stop suddenly transformed into a coordinated team of law enforcement officers. It reminded him of watching waves hit the shore, the quiet build-up, then the powerful rush of action. The girl in the yellow hoodie had just entered the women's restroom when the officers made their move. Two female officers who had been pretending to stock shelves quickly followed her inside. At the same moment, other plainclothes officers smoothly surrounded the two men who had been waiting in the corridor. "Police, don't move." The commands were clear but controlled, keeping the volume down to avoid causing panic among other customers. James could see it all through the building's large windows, his hands gripping his steering wheel as he watched years of law enforcement training play out. The taller man tried to reach for something under his jacket, but an officer was already there, pinning his arm. The other suspect attempted to bolt toward the back exit, only to find his path blocked by two more officers who seemed to materialize from the snack aisle. The takedown was swift, professional, and surprisingly quiet. Regular customers barely had time to realize what was happening. A few store employees, who had been briefed moments before, calmly directed other patrons away from the area. The whole scene played out like a well-rehearsed dance, with everyone knowing their exact roles. Through his open window, James could hear fragments of radio chatter as more marked police vehicles pulled into the lot. Suspects secured, weapons recovered, minor is safe. Each update made his shoulders relax a little more. The girl's brave signal at the rest stop had set all this in motion, and now she was finally safe. The glass doors slid open, and James watched as officers led the two men out in handcuffs. Their professional appearances couldn't hide their true nature anymore. The taller one's polo shirt was wrinkled from the takedown, and his face was tight with anger. The other man kept his head down, already looking defeated. A few minutes later, the girl emerged, escorted by the female officers. She had a blanket around her shoulders now, and a kind-faced woman in plain clothes walked beside her, speaking softly. Even from a distance, James could see the tension leaving her body with each step. She looked smaller somehow, more like the teenager she really was, now that she didn't have to be brave anymore. Detective Wilson's voice crackled over James's phone, both suspects in custody. 2 handguns recovered, plus multiple phones and fake IDs. The girl is safe and being checked by medical personnel. You did good, Marine. James watched as they led the girl to an unmarked SUV with tinted windows. A female officer helped her into the back seat, then sat beside her. He noticed someone had given her a bottle of water and what looked like a snack from the store. Small comforts, but important ones. More police cars arrived, their lights painting the truck stop in flashes of red and blue. State troopers set up a perimeter, and crime scene units began their work. James saw officers taking photos of the suspect's vehicle, gathering evidence that would help build a case against these traffickers. "We're going to need your statement," Detective Wilson told him. "But it can wait until tomorrow. We've got your contact information, and you must be exhausted from all this." James checked his logbook. He'd been awake for nearly 15 hours, but somehow he didn't feel tired. "I can stay if you need me to," he offered. "You've done more than enough," the detective assured him. "The girl's parents are already on their way from South Carolina. By this time tomorrow, she'll be home safe with her family. That's thanks to you noticing what others missed." Through the car window, James saw the girl look in his direction. She gave a small wave, not the distress signal this time, but a real wave of gratitude. He waved back, remembering how scared she'd looked at the rest stop just hours ago. One of the state troopers approached his truck. "Sir, we've got your information and we'll be in touch tomorrow. You should get some rest. There's another truck stop about 30 miles ahead if you need it." James nodded, starting his engine. As he prepared to pull out, he saw more officers arriving, more evidence being collected. The night now was over for one young girl, and the evidence they gathered tonight might help save others. Guiding his truck back onto the highway, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His military training had taught him to be observant, to take action when needed, and to work as part of a team. Tonight, those skills had helped change someone's life. As the truck stop's lights faded in his rearview mirror, he said a quiet prayer of thanks, thankful for the training that had prepared him for this moment, and thankful that one brave young girl would sleep safely tonight. 1 week had passed since that night at the Alabama truck stop. James sat at his kitchen table, morning sunlight streaming through the window as he read the newspaper article for the 3rd time. The headline was simple but powerful. "Multi-state trafficking ring busted, multiple victims rescued." The article didn't mention him by name. He'd asked to remain anonymous. But reading about the bigger picture made his heart both heavy and hopeful. The 2 men arrested that night were part of a larger network. Their phones and documents had led police to more traffickers, more victims. In the past week, law enforcement had rescued 6 more girls across 3 states. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Wilson. "Thought you'd want to know. She's doing well. Back in school this week. Family says thank you." James smiled, remembering the girl's brave signal at the rest stop. He'd learned a little more about her story during his official statement. She'd been missing for 3 weeks, taken while walking home from a friend's house. Her parents had been searching frantically, posting flyers, working with police. Now she was home, safe, getting the help she needed to heal. The coffee maker beeped, pulling him back to the present. As he poured himself a cup, his sister called. "Just saw the news about those traffickers," she said. "The ones you helped catch. They're saying it's one of the biggest cases this year." "Just did what anyone would do," James replied, but his sister wasn't having it. "No, not anyone would have noticed. Not anyone would have known what to do. Those girls are safe because you paid attention, because you cared enough to act." After hanging up, James walked out onto his small back porch. His next trucking route would start tomorrow, Atlanta to Dallas, another long haul across the highways of America. He thought about all the truck stops, all the rest areas, all the places where people passed each other every day without really seeing. His Marine training had taught him to be observant, to look for signs others might miss. But it wasn't just about training. It was about choosing to pay attention, choosing to get involved when something felt wrong. About remembering that behind every suspicious situation, there might be someone silently asking for help. The local news had wanted to interview him, but James had declined. He wasn't comfortable being called a hero. In his mind, the real hero was that young girl who had been brave enough to signal for help, who had kept her wits about her in a terrifying situation. Later that afternoon, he drove to the local community center where he occasionally helped with self-defense classes. Today was different. He was meeting with the director to discuss starting a new program. One that would teach people about recognizing signs of trafficking, about what to do if they spotted something suspicious. "We could save more people," he explained to the director, "if more folks knew what to look for, if they knew how to report things safely." The director was already nodding, pulling out forms to get the program started. That evening, as James packed his bag for tomorrow's route, he thought about how life could change in an instant. One moment you're making a routine stop, the next you're part of something much bigger than yourself. His dog tags clinked softly as he moved around the room, reminding him of all the training that had prepared him for that night. The news had reported that the trafficking ring had been operating for 2 years, moving young people across state lines, destroying lives and families. Now it was shut down, its leaders facing long prison sentences. All because one girl was brave enough to signal for help, and someone was trained to recognize that signal. James checked his route map one last time before bed. Tomorrow he'd be back on the road, watching the endless flow of traffic, staying alert for anything out of place. The highways could be lonely places, but they were also places where alert eyes could make a difference. His final task of the night was adding a new number to his phone contacts, a nationwide trafficking hotline. He'd already memorized it, but having it saved could save precious minutes if he ever needed it again. As he set his alarm for the early morning drive, James thought about all the other truckers, all the other travelers on America's highways. "Keep your eyes open," he whispered to himself, a quiet prayer for all those still out there, still waiting to be found. Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, a hand signal, a careful observation, a choice to get involved. And somewhere out there, other lives were waiting to be saved by someone who cared enough to pay attention.